The wind out here doesn't just blow, it hunts. At 70 degrees north, inside the Arctic Circle, the cold is a physical weight, pressing against my chest plates like a second tactical vest. My breath fogs the lens of the gas mask, creating a claustrophobic haze every time I exhale. I check the Geiger counter strapped to my wrist. The numbers are dancing, not high enough to melt my skin, but high enough to tell me I shouldn't be here. But then again, with the way the world looks back home, cities burning, the infected tearing through the suburbs of Chicago and D.C. Shouldn't be here is a relative term. I'm looking for the origin point. I'm looking for the trigger of Protocol Black. It took me 3 weeks to trek across the ice shelf from the drop point. My sled is lighter now, supplies dwindling. I'm down to my last 3 MREs and 2 magazines for the 416 Hong Kong dollars. The silencer is frosted over, white rime clinging to the matte black metal. I pause, crouching behind a ridge of jagged ice, scanning the horizon. There it is. Just like the encrypted dossier said. It looks like a scar on the world, a massive, concrete maw jutting out of a glacier. Rusted rebar twisting out of it like the ribcage of some leviathan beast. The Soviet submarine base. Object 825. Or at least, a sister site that never made it onto the CIA's maps. I move forward, the snow crunching loudly under my boots. In this silence, it sounds like a gunshot. I keep my rifle raised, thumb hovering over the safety. The entrance is a massive blast door, partially buckled inward. Something, or someone, tried to get in, or get out, with extreme prejudice decades ago. The steel is thick, painted with faded Cyrillic warning signs that the salt air has chewed into illegibility. But I know what they say. Biohazard. Do not enter. The irony isn't lost on me. I pull the heavy lever on the personnel hatch. It screams, metal grinding on metal, echoing across the vast white emptiness. I freeze, waiting. Watching. Nothing moves on the ice. The infected hate the cold, they freeze solid, but out here? Out here, I'm worried about what the Soviets left behind that doesn't freeze. Inside, the air changes. It's stale, smelling of diesel, wet concrete, and copper. Blood. Old blood. I click on my shoulder-mounted light. The beam cuts through the darkness, illuminating a cavernous tunnel designed to swallow Typhoon-class submarines. The water in the pen is frozen black glass. Sitting there, encased in the ice, is the con tower of a sub, listed to the side. It's a ghost ship in a concrete tomb. I check my corners. Clear. But the vibe is heavy. It feels like the air is pressurized, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. I make my way toward the control center, boots echoing on the metal grating of the catwalks. The dossier mentioned Protocol Black, a joint operation, off the books, between a rogue faction of the KGB and, well, us. The U.S. shadow government. They were working on something here in the 80s. A weaponization of the human genome. Survival at any cost. That's what SHTF really means to the elites. It's not about bunkers, it's about evolution. Forced, violent evolution. I find a skeleton in a hallway. Wearing a lab coat over a military uniform. skull crushed. Not by a bullet. By force. Blunt trauma. I kneel to inspect it. The bones are brittle, but the ID badge is plastic, preserved. Dr. V. Volkov. I take it. Intel. My flashlight flickers. I tap the side of the mount. Batteries are dying in the cold faster than expected. I swap them out, darkness swallowing me for 10 terrifying seconds. In that dark I hear it. A wet dragging sound. Deep in the complex. Down below the waterline levels. Protocol Black isn't a contingency plan, I whisper to myself, the realization hitting me colder than the Arctic wind. It's the patient zero. I push into the command center. Banks of analog computers, reel-to-reel tape decks, and maps of the United States covering the walls. Red markers on New York, Los Angeles, Atlanta. Targets? No. Deployment zones. This was planned decades ago. I start rifling through the filing cabinets. Most are empty, burned. But one drawer is locked. I pry it open with my combat knife. Inside, a thick folder stamped with the dual eagles of the U.S. and the hammer and sickle. Impossible. Yet here it is. I open it. Photos. Grainy, black and white photos of test subjects. They look like the infected back home, but smarter. Wearing armor. Holding weapons. Suddenly, the dragging sound stops. I spin around, rifle up, aiming down the corridor I just came from. Silence. Then, a metallic clang. Someone is here. Or something. I retreat deeper into the room, scanning for a secondary exit. There's a heavy bulkhead door labeled Archives in Russian. I move to it, trying the wheel. It spins. Unlocked. Bad sign. Unlocked means someone went in and didn't care if they were followed, or they wanted to be found. I push through. The room beyond is filled with specimen tanks. Shattered glass covers the floor. Dried fluid stains the concrete. And in the center of the room, sitting on a crate, is a tactical vest. American issue. Current Gen 10, just like mine. I approach it slowly. There's a patch on the Velcro field. It's not a unit patch. It's a smiley face with X's for eyes. Creepy Bert. My contact. He was here. He was supposed to meet me in Montana, not here. I check the vest. Pockets empty, except for a folded piece of paper. I unfold it. One word, scrawled in charcoal, run. A low growl vibrates through the floorboards. It's not mechanical. It's organic. And it's coming from the ceiling vents. I look up, my light catching the gleam of eyes. Not dead eyes. Calculating eyes. The vent grate buckles. I rack the bolt on my rifle. Protocol Black wasn't just about making monsters. It was about making soldiers that don't need food, sleep, or mercy. And I just woke them up. The hydraulic hiss of the blast door sealing behind us felt final. It was a heavy, suffocating sound, like the lid of a coffin slamming shut, severing the howling Arctic wind outside from the stagnant, pressurized silence of the facility. The sudden quiet was almost worse than the storm. Inside, the air tasted of ozone, ancient diesel, and something metallic, like the taste of a penny held under the tongue. My breath plumed in the beam of my weapon light, a thick fog indicating the temperature was hovering just below freezing. Preserved by the subterranean insulation of the rock. Seal confirmed. Miller whispered over the comms, his voice tight. We're in. I checked my wrist-mounted Geiger counter. The readout was steady 0. 15 microsieverts. Negligible. Whatever killed this base in the 80s wasn't a reactor leak. At least, not one that had lingered in the airlock. Check your corners, I ordered, keeping my voice low. Standard CQB spacing. We don't know if the automated defenses are dormant, or just waiting for a thermal signature. We moved in a stack, boots crunching softly on frost-covered grating. The architecture was brutalist Soviet utility. Thick bundles of cabling running along the ceiling like black intestines. Cyrillic warning stencils faded on gray bulkheads, and the oppressive weight of millions of tons of ice and rock above us. This was Object 882. The base that didn't exist on any map, erased from the archives before the Berlin Wall even fell. Miller took point. His suppressed 18 Malawin quatches raised, the IR illuminator sweeping the gloom. Behind him was Kovac, our tech specialist, clutching a hardened tablet that was currently trying, and failing, to handshake with the facility's intranet. I brought up the rear, watching our 6. My heart rate monitor on the HUD displayed a steady 85 beats per minute, but the adrenaline was a cold drip in my veins. We breached the decontamination chamber and entered the main arterial corridor. Here, the evidence of hasty abandonment was frozen in time. A clipboard lay on the floor, shattered. A lone boot unlaced. But as we pushed deeper, the narrative of abandonment shifted to something more violent. Scorch marks marred the concrete walls, pockmarks from small arms fire. I ran a gloved finger over a crater in the cement. 7.62 millimeters, I muttered. Spalling indicates incoming fire from the command deck. They were shooting at something coming up from the pens. Sarge, Kovac hissed. Look at this. He was kneeling by a junction box, his flashlight trained on a bundle of fiber optics that had been spliced into the old copper wiring. It was modern tech. Newer than the base. Newer than the fall of the Union. This isn't Soviet surplus, Kovac said, tracing the line. This is high-bandwidth cabling. Someone retrofitted this place. Recently. My grip on the rifle tightened. The mission brief had been simple: reconnaissance and salvage. The CIA spook in Oslo had claimed the base was a ghost town, a relic to be picked clean of Cold War ciphers. He hadn't mentioned recent renovations. He certainly hadn't mentioned Protocol Black. Keep moving, I commanded. Objective is the command and control center. We need the logs. We descended 3 flights of stairs, the metal groaning under our weight. The air grew colder, heavier. We emerged onto a catwalk overlooking the main submarine pen. It was a cavernous space, vast enough to house a cathedral, carved out of the living rock. Below, in the black, oily water, sat the silhouette of a Typhoon-class submarine. It was a leviathan of steel, listing slightly to port, rusted and scarred. But it wasn't the sub that stopped me cold. It was the lighting. Halogen work lights were strung up along the dock, powered by a silent, humming generator somewhere in the dark. Crates were stacked on the concrete quay. Modern polymer shipping containers, marked with no flags, no serial numbers. Just a black circle with a jagged line through it. Contact, Miller signaled, hand snapping up. We froze. On the dock below, 50 meters down, a figure lay prone near the gangway of the sub. I switched my optics to thermal. The figure was blue, cold. Dead. Cover me, I said. We moved down the spiraling gantry stairs, weapons trained on the shadows. Every creak of the metal sounded like a gunshot. When we reached the dock, the smell of rot hit us, cutting through the cold. We approached the body. It wasn't a Russian sailor. The corpse was dressed in high-end tactical gear, multicam black, plate carrier, fast helmet with panoramic NVGs shattered on the concrete. A PMC. I checked his shoulder patch. It had been ripped off, leaving only Velcro fuzz. Who the hell is this? Miller asked, nudging the body with his boot. The man's face was frozen in a rictus of terror, skin blackened by frostbite. A mercenary, I said, checking the magazine in the dead man's rifle. It was empty. And he died fighting. Fighting what? Kovac asked, his voice trembling slightly. He was looking at the man's chest rig. It was slashed. Not cut with a knife, but torn. 3 parallel gouges had shredded the Kevlar and ceramic plate as if they were wet paper. I don't know, I lied. I had a suspicion, a gnawing dread that linked back to the dossier's redacted paragraphs. I moved to the shipping container nearest the body. The lock had been shot off. I hauled the door open. Inside, it was an improvised lab. Computer terminals, centrifuges, and containment units. Most were smashed. But one terminal was blinking a green cursor. Kovac pushed past me, hooking his tablet into the hard line. I'm scraping the drive. Give me 30 seconds. Miller watched the sub. I ordered, scanning the catwalks above us. The sense of being watched was itching at the base of my skull. I've got files, Kovac muttered, typing furiously. God, this isn't a salvage operation, Sarge. This is a containment site. The Soviets didn't abandon this place because of the collapse. They were forced out. They found something in the ice shelf during the drilling in '89. Something biological. Protocol Black. I said, the pieces clicking into place. Yeah, Kovac replied, his face pale in the screen's glow. Listen to this log entry from the PMC commander, dated 3 days ago. Subject 882 Alpha has breached containment. The neural inhibitors failed. We are initiating Protocol Black. Total facility sterilization. If you are receiving this, do not land. Do not attempt rescue. Bomb the entrance. A loud, metallic clank echoed from the submarine's open hatch. We all spun, weapons raised. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with threat. Then, the facility's PA system crackled to life. It wasn't a voice. It was a sound, a low, oscillating frequency that vibrated in our teeth, followed by the grinding screech of heavy machinery. "They triggered it," Kovac yelled, ripping the cable free. "The lockdown!" Above us, on the gantry we had just descended, massive blast shutters began to slide across the exit points. Red emergency lights bathed the submarine pen in a bloody glow. "Move! Back to the stairs!" I roared. We sprinted. But we were too slow. The shutters slammed down with earth-shaking force, sealing us in the pen. The only way out was blocked. We were trapped in the belly of the earth with the water, the rust, and whatever had torn through a ceramic plate carrier like it was cardboard. Then the lights on the dock died. Total darkness. "Night vision on!" I commanded, flipping my tubes down. The world turned into a grainy green phosphor. "Sarge!" Miller's voice was a harsh whisper over the comms. "Thermal contact. 12 o'clock. On top of the sub. I looked. There, standing on the con tower of the Typhoon, was a silhouette. It was human-shaped, but wrong. The limbs were too long, the posture too rigid. It radiated a heat signature that burned white-hot against the freezing background. It stood motionless, staring down at us. Then, the Geiger counter on my wrist began to scream. The hydraulic groan of the blast door ceiling behind me severed the connection to the howling Arctic wind. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, pressurized, the kind of silence that feels like it's waiting for permission to break. My ears popped as the internal scrubbers pressurized the airlock, a mechanical hiss that sounded too much like a dying breath. I checked the atmospheric readout on my wrist. Oxygen levels were low but breathable, temperature rising to a balmy 2 degrees Celsius. I kept my gas mask on. I didn't trust the air in a Soviet tomb sealed since 1991, especially not one designated Protocol Black. I initiated a gear check, a ritual to steady my shaking hands. The Terpi radiometer was clipped to my chest rig, chirping a steady, rhythmic warning 0. 18 microsieverts. Elevated, but not acute. My primary light source, a heavy-duty tactical torch mounted to my shoulder, cut a harsh cone through the suspended dust particles. In my right hand I gripped the pry bar, its steel cold enough to burn through my gloves. In my waistband, the Glock 19 felt woefully inadequate against the scale of this place, but the weight was grounding. I wasn't a soldier, just a salvage operator who pushed too far north, but survival instincts are universal. The inner wheel of the airlock spun with a grinding screech, metal shearing against rusted metal. I put my shoulder into it, forcing the mechanism until the latches disengaged with a dull thud. I pushed into the corridor beyond. The architecture was brutalist oppression manifest. Bare concrete walls, floor grates revealing dark piping below and overhead. Bundles of thick cables snaked like dormant arteries. The air here tasted metallic, bitter with the scent of ozone and something sweeter, sickeningly familiar, old copper-rich blood. I moved tactically, slicing the pie at every corner, sweeping the beam into the shadows before my body followed. My boots, dampened by the snow melt, made squelching sounds on the grating that echoed too far down the hall. I needed to find the command deck. If the base layout followed the standard Project 941 schematics I'd studied, command would be 3 levels up, overlooking the dry dock. That's where the answers were. That's where I could find out why a base that didn't exist on any map had a reactor signature that just pinged my thermal satellite uplink an hour ago. At the first junction, I found the first body. It wasn't a skeleton. The Arctic cold is a master preserver, mummifying tissue into a leather-hard shell. The corpse was slumped against a bulkhead, wearing a uniform that wasn't standard Soviet Navy. It was darker, synthetic weave, no rank insignia. Interior Ministry troops? Or something more clandestine? The man had died gripping a Makarov pistol, the slide locked back, empty. I knelt, examining the scene. There were deep gouges in the concrete wall opposite him. Not bullet holes. Claw marks. 3 distinct parallel furrows, torn through the rebar. Whatever he had been shooting at hadn't been using a gun. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat and scavenged the Makarov, though it was useless without ammo. I checked his pockets. A plastic ID card, brittle with cold, cracked in my fingers, but I salvaged a folded piece of paper from his breast pocket. It was a log sheet, stamped with red ink, ATL 12 containment failure. Beneath it, a handwritten scrawl in rapid, panic Cyrillic, asterisk the water filters failed. It's in the condensation. Don't sleep. If you sleep, the dreams let it in. Asterisk. I stood up, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Protocol Black wasn't an evacuation order. It was a quarantine. A purge. I pushed deeper, taking the stairs upward. The silence was broken now by the distant, low-frequency thrum of machinery. The reactor. It was idling, keeping the life support systems on a ghost setting. As I reached level 2, the corridor lights flickered. Not the emergency red I expected, but a sickly, sodium yellow. The power grid was fluctuating, responding to a load demand. Suddenly, the PA system crackled. Static, sharp and violent, tore through the corridor, making me drop to a knee, weapon raised. Through the white noise, a synthesized voice, warped by decades of magnetic degradation, spoke a single phrase on a loop, asterisk. Violation in Sector 4. Biological seal compromised. Initiating sterilization protocol in T-. Error. T-. Error. Asterisk. The loop stuttered and died. Sector 4. I glanced at the faded wall map near the stairwell. Sector 4 was the medical research wing. It was directly between me and the command deck. There was no other route. The auxiliary bulkheads were welded shut. I could see the beads of slag from where I stood. They had sealed themselves in. I checked the radiation dosimeter again. The clicking had doubled in speed. 40 microsieverts. I was getting closer to the core, or something leaking from it. I adjusted my gas mask straps, ensuring the seal was airtight. The handwritten note about the condensation terrified me. If the threat was airborne, or waterborne, my filters were the only thing keeping me human. As I entered the promenade of Sector 4, the atmosphere shifted. The industrial smell vanished, replaced by the sterile, biting odor of formaldehyde and bleach, underlaid by a stench of rotting kelp. The doors here were heavy glass and steel. Through the grime-streaked observation windows, I saw rows of empty gurneys. On the floor of the main lab, smashed petri dishes glittered like diamonds in my flashlight beam. Then I saw the tank. In the center of the lab, a cylindrical holding tank, easily 3 meters tall, stood filled with murky, greenish liquid. It was backlit by the failing emergency power. Inside, something floated. It was humanoid, but wrong. Elongated limbs, pale and translucent. The torso was distended, ribs flared out like gills. It drifted lazily in the suspension fluid, a specimen of nightmare biology. I stepped closer to the glass, morbid curiosity overriding survival instinct. A plaque at the base read, Project Vadianu Subject 003. My light caught the glass surface of the tank. It was cracked. A spiderweb fracture radiating from the inside out. And the tank was empty. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The murky liquid wasn't obscuring the subject. The subject was gone. The liquid was just residue. Asterisk click. Asterisk. The sound came from the ventilation conduct directly above my head. It wasn't mechanical. It was the wet, sticky sound of cartilage shifting. I froze, killing my flashlight instantly. Darkness swallowed the corridor, save for the flickering sodium bulb down the hall. I held my breath, my lungs burning, clutching the pry bar so hard my knuckles popped. Asterisk drip. Asterisk. A drop of viscous fluid landed on my shoulder. It didn't feel like water. It burned, a cold chemical sizzle against my parka. Slowly, agonizingly, I looked up, activating the red tactical filter on my secondary light to preserve night vision. The vent grate was gone. Hanging from the opening, staring down at me with eyes that reflected the red light like polished obsidian, was a face that used to be human. The skin was sloughed off in patches, revealing raw, gray muscle underneath. It didn't scream. It didn't roar. It hissed, a sound like steam escaping a valve, and tensed its legs to spring. I didn't think. I reacted. I swung the pry bar upward with every ounce of adrenaline-fueled strength I possessed, aiming for the creature's skull just as it launched itself from the ceiling. The impact shuddered through my arms, a sickening crunch of bone and metal, knocking the thing sideways in midair. It crashed into a metal instrument trolley, sending trays of rusted scalpels clattering across the floor. I didn't wait to see if it got up. I ran. I sprinted toward the heavy blast doors at the end of the medical wing, my boots slamming against the floor, slipping on the slick patches of unknown fluid. Behind me, a high-pitched, chittering shriek echoed through the halls, joined by the sound of other vents bursting open. They were waking up. Protocol Black hadn't failed. It was still running, and I had just become part of the experiment. The silence in Sector 4 wasn't empty. It was heavy, pressing against my eardrums like the atmosphere of a dead planet. My boots, spiked for traction on the ice-slick gantry, made a grinding crunch with every step that echoed too far down the corridor. I stopped, holding my breath, forcing my heart rate to decelerate. The readout on my wrist-mounted pulse oximeter flickered, 135 BPM. Too high. Panic burned oxygen, and down here, air was a finite currency. I adjusted the valve on my rebreather, tasting the stale, recycled rubber air, and checked the Geiger counter clipped to my belt. The needle on the old Soviet DP5V was trembling just above the green zone. 0.8 millisieverts. Not lethal yet, but climbing. I was deep below the ice shelf now, past the rusted dry docks where the husks of Typhoon-class submarines rotted in their pens. This was the administrative heart of the facility, or so the faded Cyrillic stenciled on the bulkheads claimed. CMDCTR/BioLabs. A combination that shouldn't exist. Naval bases house torpedoes and sonar arrays, not biological research stations. The mystery of the signal that drew me here, the rhythmic digital heartbeat broadcasting on a dead frequency, was deepening into something far darker than a simple Cold War relic. I swept the beam of my tactical light across the wall. Condensation had frozen into intricate, crystalline patterns over the peeling lead paint. There were scratch marks beneath the ice. Deep gouges in the steel, 4 parallel lines repeated over and over at waist height. Desperation? Someone had tried to claw through a blast door with their bare hands or improvised tools. I knelt, examining the floor. Spent brass casings. 45 by 39 millimeters. Standard Soviet issue, but the corrosion was wrong. These weren't from the 1980s. The brass was relatively bright, the oxidation minimal. Someone had fired a weapon here less than a decade ago. Protocol Black, I whispered, the words misting inside my faceplate. The dossier I'd recovered in the upper barracks mentioned it only once, a contingency for total containment failure. I moved forward, stepping over a collapsed ventilation duct. The corridor widened into a rotunda. In the center, a command console sat beneath a shattered glass dome. Shielded from the crushing weight of the Arctic ice above by reinforced strata-glass. A single terminal blinked with a cursor, the amber phosphor burning in the darkness. It was the source. It had to be. I approached the console, my gloved fingers hovering over the Cyrillic keyboard. The keys were sticky with a frozen black residue. I wiped it away, dried blood, and typed the override code I'd found earlier, 7-4-1-9. The screen flickered, text scrolling rapidly. System log, entry 4402. Date corrupted. Status, Protocol Black active. Target, subjects 1 to 89. Containment, 0%. 0% containment. The blood in my veins turned to slush. I scrolled down. The log wasn't just an error report. It was a death warrant. The base hadn't been abandoned due to funding cuts or the collapse of the Union. It had been sealed from the outside. The crew inside hadn't been evacuated. They had been purged. But the purge failed. A metallic clank rang out from the darkness behind me. I spun around, unholstering the flare gun, my only real weapon against whatever lurked here besides a climbing axe. The beam of my flashlight cut through the gloom, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. Nothing. Just the dripping of condensation. But the sound had been distinct. Metal on metal. Heavy. I turned back to the screen, frantically downloading the data to my ruggedized drive. I needed proof. I needed to know what subjects 1 to 89 were. As the progress bar crawled to 98%, the terminal let out a piercing shriek, an audio warning that bypassed my headset and drilled into my skull. The amber text vanished, replaced by a single, flashing red prompt. Biometric scan detected. Unauthorized life form. Initiating sterilization. The facility groaned. Deep in the walls, hydraulics hissed to life. The floor beneath me vibrated. I grabbed the drive, ripping it from the port just as the overhead halogens flickered on, not with light, but with the angry, ultraviolet hum of sterilization lamps. I shielded my eyes, the UV intense enough to burn retinas instantly. I scrambled back into the corridor, the heavy blast door I'd entered through beginning to slide shut. No, no, no! I lunged for the gap. The gears ground together, rust screaming against rust. I threw my climbing axe into the mechanism, the hardened steel biting into the cog. The door shuddered and jammed, leaving a 2-foot gap at the bottom. I dove through, sliding on the icy floor, my tank scraping violently against the descending steel. I cleared the threshold just as the axe snapped, the handle shearing off with a crack like a gunshot. The door slammed home, sealing the command center. I was on the other side, breathing hard, checking my suit for tears. Integrity held. But I wasn't safe. The sterilization wasn't just UV lights. Vents in the ceiling above me opened with a pneumatic hiss. A thick, yellow gas began to pour out, heavier than air, cascading down the walls like a waterfall. Nerve gas? Or something worse? I scrambled to my feet, checking the map on my forearm slate. To the east, the reactor room. To the west, the sub-pens. The sub-pens meant water, freezing and deadly, but potentially an exit if I could find a dry suit or a functional escape pod. The reactor room meant radiation but likely had independent ventilation systems. The gas hit the floor and began to spread toward me, rolling over my boots. I chose the reactor. I ran. The tactical movement was gone. This was pure flight. My boots hammered the grating. The yellow fog chased me, swirling with unnatural speed, as if guided by a hive mind. I reached a junction, vaulting over a barricade of overturned desks. Behind the barricade lay a corpse. Not a skeleton. A desiccated, mummified body in a modern Arctic warfare suit. No patches. No flags. A mercenary? I paused for a split second, grabbing the rifle lying across the body's chest. An AK-12? Modern Russian military. The magazine was empty, the bolt locked back. He'd gone down fighting. I checked his pouches, 2 spare mags. I grabbed them, my hands shaking, and slapped one into the receiver. I racked the bolt. Now I had teeth. I pushed through the double doors marked reactor control. The air here was colder, biting through my thermal layers. The Geiger counter spiked instantly, 3.5 millisieverts. The shielding was cracked. I could feel the metallic taste of radiation on my tongue, bypassing the filters. I sealed the door behind me, spinning the locking wheel until my muscles burned. Through the thick porthole window, I watched the yellow gas fill the corridor I had just vacated. It pressed against the glass, obscuring the view. Safe. For the moment. I turned to face the reactor room. The core was a looming silhouette in the darkness, illuminated only by the faint blue glow of Cherenkov radiation emanating from the open cooling pool below. But it wasn't the radiation that froze me in place. Standing on the walkway surrounding the open core, silhouetted against the blue glow, was a figure. It wore a heavy, rubberized suit, bulky and archaic, like an early diver's rig. A thick hose connected the helmet to the ceiling rails. It wasn't moving. It was watching me. I raised the AK-12, the red dot sight trembling. "Identify!" I shouted, my voice cracking. The figure didn't speak. Slowly, mechanically it raised a hand. The glove was massive, reinforced with steel plates. It pointed not at me, but at the Geiger counter on my hip. I looked down. The needle wasn't trembling anymore. It was pegged to the maximum. My vision blurred. The blue glow of the reactor seemed to pulse. It wasn't just radiation leaking from the core. The figure was radioactive. It was a walking fuel rod. Protocol Black. A synthesized voice rasped over the facility's intercom, distorted and skipping. Subject 9 awake. The figure took a step toward me. The metal grating beneath its boot melted, dripping into the pool below with a hiss of superheated steam. I backed up, hitting the sealed door. The gas was behind me. The walking reactor was in front of me. I looked at the cooling pool. The water was dark, deep, and likely irradiated, but it connected to the lower drainage channels. It was a suicide jump. Subject 9 took another step. The heat coming off it triggered the thermal warning in my suit. Tactical assessment. I muttered to myself, the words a mantra to keep insanity at bay. Options: burn, choke, or drown. I tightened the straps on my mask, checked the seal, and sprinted toward the edge of the cooling pool. Subject 9 swiped at me, a sluggish, hydraulic motion, but the heat wave alone singed the fabric of my sleeve. I didn't stop. I planted my foot on the railing and launched myself into the void, plummeting toward the glowing blue water below. The reverberation of the hydraulic locks disengaging wasn't just a sound, it was a physical blow. It hammered against my chest, vibrating through the layers of Kevlar and thermal wool, signaling that the silence of the last 4 hours was officially dead. I pressed my back against the cold, sweating concrete of the bulkhead, counting the heartbeats thudding in my ears. 1, 2, 3. The readout on my wrist-mounted Geiger counter spiked momentarily, 0. 45 microsieverts, before settling back down. Not lethal yet. But it confirmed my theory. Someone had just breached the primary containment seal in Sector 4, 2 levels above me. And they weren't concerned with being quiet. I checked the magazine of my suppressed 416 Hong Kong dollars. 28 rounds of subsonic ammunition. I had 2 spare mags on my plate carrier, a single fragmentation grenade, and a flare. Not enough for a war, but maybe enough for an escape. I adjusted my NVGs, the green phosphor wash of the night vision turning the rusted, dripping corridor into a surreal, emerald tunnel. The condensation hanging in the freezing air looked like static interference, I moved. Survival in an environment like this, a Soviet tomb buried under 50 feet of Arctic permafrost, is entirely about heat management. Move too fast, you sweat, you stop, the sweat freezes, and hypothermia kills you before the enemy does. Move too slow, and your extremities go numb, ruining your trigger pull. I kept a steady, rolling gait, heel to toe, silencing my footfalls on the steel grating. The objective was the Signal Intelligence Hub on Level 3. If the dossier I'd pulled from the dead lieutenant in the mess hall was accurate, that's where the hardline connection to the Protocol Black servers terminated. I reached a junction. To the left, the mess hall and the barracks. To the right, a downward slope toward the coolant reservoirs. I took the right, slicing the corner with my muzzle raised. The darkness here was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that seemed to press against my optics. My breath plumed in the IR illuminator's beam. Then, the sound of boots. Hard rubber on metal. Fast. Efficient. I killed my IR light immediately, melting into the recess of a heavy blast door frame. Through the passive light amplification I saw them. 4 silhouettes, moving in a tight diamond formation. They were professional, movements synchronized, weapons shoulder-mounted, scanning high and low. They weren't looting, they were hunting. The patches on their shoulders were obscured by thermocloaks, but their gear screamed Tier 1 private military contractors. Probably Vanguard, the outfit rumored to clean up loose ends for the energy consortium's drilling up here. They were here for the same thing I was, which meant the stakes had just shifted from exploration to execution. I let them pass. Engaging 4 tangos in a fatal funnel like this corridor was suicide. I needed leverage. Once their footsteps faded toward the reactor core, I slipped out. Moving in their wake but diverting toward a maintenance shaft I'd noted on the schematics earlier. The hatch was rusted shut, the wheel seized by decades of oxidation and ice. I pulled a small pry bar from my webbing, jamming it into the wheel's spokes. With a grunt of exertion that I stifled in my throat, I torqued it. Metal groaned, a high-pitched shriek that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. I froze, weapon up, waiting for the shout, the beam of a flashlight. Nothing. The ambient hum of the facility's dying ventilation system must have masked it. I forced the hatch open and dropped into the crawlspace. The smell hit me instantly, ozone and copper. The smell of high-voltage electronics and old blood. I crawled through the ductwork, the jagged screws tearing at my outer shell. The schematics burned in my mind. 50 meters to the server room drop. As I shimmied forward, the mystery of Protocol Black began to fester in my thoughts. The logs I'd read in Chapter 3 hadn't just mentioned a shutdown. They mentioned a biological feedback loop. The Soviets hadn't just been building submarines here. They were listening to something. Something under the ice. And whatever they heard, it didn't just scare them. It made them weld the doors shut from the inside. I reached the vent grate overlooking the Signal Intelligence Hub. I peered through the slats. The room was massive, illuminated by the dying amber glow of emergency reserve power. Banks of reel-to-reel tape drives lined the walls, most of them motionless. But the central terminal, a massive monolith of Soviet engineering, was active. The screen flickered with Cyrillic text, scrolling too fast to read. I kicked the grate out. It clattered to the floor, echoing loudly. No time for stealth now. I dropped, landing in a crouch, weapon traversing the room. Clear. I sprinted to the terminal, holstering my rifle and pulling an interface cable from my pack. I jacked into the port. My handheld decryption unit lit up, handshake protocols initiating. "Come on," I whispered, my breath misting on the screen. The text stabilized. I recognized the header, Object 77 Status Report Final. I scanned the translation. Subject shows no sign of physiological degradation despite 0 Kelvin exposure. Acoustic resonance is increasing. The crew is experiencing hallucinations, auditory pareidolia. The command is given. Initiate Protocol Black. My blood ran cold, colder than the Arctic air. Protocol Black wasn't a containment breach protocol. It was a sterilization order. They had flooded the lower levels to drown whatever subject they had found, and then sealed the base to trap the crew with it. "Contact front!" A voice barked from the upper gantry. I didn't look up. I ripped the drive from the terminal just as the glass of the CRT monitor exploded, showered by a hail of 5.56mm rounds. I threw myself behind the heavy steel console. Bullets sparked off the metal, the deafening cracks of unsuppressed rifle fire filling the room. "Suppressing!" another voice yelled. I was pinned. Vanguard had found me. I checked my angles. They had the high ground on the catwalks. I was a rat in a bucket. I pulled the pin on my frag grenade, counting 2 seconds, and lobbed it high over the console toward the gantry. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space, blowing out the remaining lights and sending a section of the catwalk grinding down to the floor. Screams followed. I didn't wait to see the damage. I popped my flare, throwing it into the center of the room. The blinding red magnesium light flared up, washing out their night vision goggles. Blind! I'm blind! I switched to thermal on my own optics. The room was a wash of blue and cold, with the flare burning white-hot in the center. I saw 2 heat signatures up on the rails, flailing, trying to rip their goggles off. I took 2 shots. Single fire. Controlled. Both targets dropped. But there were more. I could hear them breaching the north door. I looked at the heavy blast door behind me, the one marked Level 5 deep storage. The warning signs were painted in red, extreme biohazard. I had no choice. The Vanguard team would flank me in 30 seconds. I slammed the release mechanism for the Level 5 door. The ancient gear screamed, protesting the movement. The heavy iron slab began to slide upward, revealing a pitch-black maw leading down into the bowels of the base. A damp, rotten wind rushed up from the darkness, smelling of brine and ancient decay. It hit me with the force of a physical shove. "Target is moving to the lower levels," a Vanguard operator shouted, his voice distorted by a gas mask. I turned and fired 3 rounds to keep their heads down, then slid under the rising door. As I scrambled to my feet on the other side, I hit the manual override to slam it shut. Through the narrowing gap, I saw the vanguard team leader. He wasn't firing. He was just watching me, and for a second, I thought I saw him shake his head. As the door sealed with a final, earth-shaking thud, locking me in the dark, I realized why. He wasn't letting me escape. He was letting me entrap myself. I turned to face the descent. The air here was different. Heavier. And there was a sound, faint, rhythmic, vibrating through the soles of my boots. It sounded like a heartbeat, slow and massive, echoing up from the flooded depths where the Soviets had tried, and failed, to kill Object 77. I checked my ammo. 20 rounds left. The decryption drive in my pocket felt heavy, like a stone. I clicked my flashlight on. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing a spiral staircase descending into black water. Protocol Black, I muttered to the darkness. Let's see what you were trying to hide. I began the descent. The silence of the Arctic is a myth. It is never truly quiet. The ice groans, the wind howls, and the metal of this forgotten Leviathan contracts in the bitter cold, singing a lullaby of structural failure. But the sound that froze the blood in my veins wasn't the facility dying. It was the rhythmic, disciplined crunch of boots on the overhead grating. I pressed myself into the rusted curvature of a torpedo rack, the smell of ancient grease and ozone heavy in the air. My breath plumed in front of me, a traitorous white flag I had to stifle with a gloved hand. Above, in the gloom of the dry dock's upper gantry, beams of high-lumen tactical lights cut through the darkness like scalpels. They weren't moving like explorers. They were moving like sweepers. Protocol Black. The phrase from the dossier I'd scavenged in the medical bay flashed in my mind. Whatever had happened here in 1982, whatever had turned the crew into the horrors I'd seen in the lower labs, someone wanted it buried. And these new arrivals, clad in black, faceless beneath thermal optics, carrying suppressed carbines, were the shovel. I counted 6 sets of footsteps. Standard fire team. They weren't speaking, just using hand signals and terrifyingly efficient movement. I checked my own inventory. A rusted flare gun with 2 rounds, a heavy iron pry bar, and a Geiger counter that I had prayed would stop clicking. It was clicking now, a frantic, insectoid rhythm against my chest. Sector 4 clear. A voice crackled. It sounded digitized, filtered through high-end comms. Deploying payload. Payload? My stomach turned. They weren't just clearing the base. They were sanitizing it. Thermite or worse. I had to move. The torpedo rack offered cover, but it was a dead end. To my left, a maintenance hatch hung slightly ajar, the stencil above it reading Auxiliary Ventilation Sector 5. It was a squeeze, a dark throat leading deeper into the facility's gut, but it was the only way out of the kill box. I slid to the floor, timing my movements with the heavy thud of their boots. Heel to toe, rolling the weight, just like I'd read in manuals I never thought I'd need to use. I reached the hatch. It groaned, a high-pitched shriek of metal on metal that sounded like a gunshot in the cavernous room. Every light on the gantry snapped toward me. Contact! I didn't wait. I threw myself into the darkness of the shaft, scrambling on hands and knees over jagged rivets and icy slush. Behind me, the air split with the hiss of suppressed fire. Sparks erupted from the hatch frame as bullets chewed into the steel. I kicked the hatch shut, jamming the pry bar through the wheel handle just as a heavy body slammed against the other side. I scrambled backward, deeper into the vent, heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The tunnel was tight, smelling of mold and something metallic, copper, maybe blood. I crawled until my knees were raw, the adrenaline fading into a cold, focused dread. The vent opened up into a larger cable run, a vertical shaft filled with thick, insulated wires the size of pythons. This was the central nervous system of the base. I needed intel. If they were destroying the base, they were destroying the evidence of Protocol Black. I needed to know what I was dying for. I rappelled down the cable run, sliding down a bundle of wires, the rubber burning my gloves. I landed on a mesh platform 2 levels down, the server farm. This room was colder than the rest. The air was pressurized, intended to keep the massive Soviet mainframes cool. Most were dead, dark monoliths of 80s tech, but one bank in the center hummed with backup power. A red light blinked on the console. I approached it, the Geiger counter spiking. 3, 5 Röntgens. Not lethal immediately, but not good. I wiped the frost from the monitor. It was still logged in, frozen in time since the evacuation order. Entries scrolled by. Logistics. Fuel reports. And then, the flagged files. Project VZOR. I opened the file. It wasn't a biological weapon. It wasn't a nuke. Subject 77 be recovered from drilling site Alpha. The log read. Depth, 4,000 meters beneath the ice shelf. Acoustic signature implies sentience. I kept reading, my eyes widening. They hadn't built a weapon, they had found one. They had drilled into a pocket of subglacial water that had been sealed for millions of years, and they had brought something up. Or rather, they had brought up a sound. Protocol Black initiates containment of auditory hazard. The final entry read. The frequency causes rapid neural degradation, paranoia, hallucination, autophagy. The crew is eating themselves. My blood ran cold. The madness I had seen in the logs, the bodies torn apart, it wasn't a virus. It was a frequency. A sound from the deep that rewired the human brain. And then I heard it. Not the soldiers. Not the wind. A low, vibrating thrum that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my teeth. It was coming from the floor. From the moon pool below the base. The clean-up crew hadn't just come to destroy the base. They had come to silence the drill. A blast rocked the facility, knocking me into the console. Dust rained down. They were blowing the structural supports. I scrambled up, grabbing a heavy reel of magnetic tape, the raw data of the frequency, and shoved it into my jacket. The hum grew louder. It felt like fingers scratching the inside of my skull. I needed to get to the sub-pens. The only way off this iceberg was the heavy assault boat the kill team had arrived in. I exited the server room, stepping out onto a catwalk overlooking the central command deck. Below I saw them. The tactical team had set up a perimeter around the blast doors leading to the lower drilling platform. But they weren't looking at the doors. They were looking at the shadows. One of the operatives suddenly screamed, a raw, tearing sound, and opened fire on empty air. His teammates shouted, checking their vitals monitors. "Bravo 3 is compromised." "He's hearing it," the leader shouted. Protocol Black was still active. The frequency was leaking. The operative turned his weapon on his own squad, firing wildly. Chaos erupted. This was my chance. I sprinted along the catwalk, the metal slick with condensation. I needed to bypass the firefight and reach the elevator to the surface docks. I was 30 meters out when the catwalk shuddered. A stray bullet had severed a hydraulic line. High-pressure fluid hissed out, creating a wall of white mist. I dove through it, sliding across the deck. I hit the elevator call button. Nothing. Power was cut to the lifts. The stairs. It had to be the stairs. As I turned, a figure emerged from the steam. It was one of the operatives. He was huge, his armor bulky, night vision goggles glowing green. He raised his rifle. I didn't think. I raised the flare gun and pulled the trigger. The magnesium round hit him center mass. It didn't penetrate the armor, but the heat and blinding light overwhelmed his optics. He thrashed, tearing the goggles from his face, screaming as the flare sizzled against his ceramic plate. I didn't wait to see him fall. I vaulted the railing, dropping 10 feet to the stairwell landing, the shock jarring my spine. I was running on pure survival instinct now. The hum in my head was getting louder, a choir of screaming voices that weren't there. I bit my tongue until I tasted copper, using the pain to anchor myself to reality. Containment breach. The PA system slurred, the voice warped by decades of decay. Sanitization imminent. I reached the hangar bay level. The blast doors to the outside were sealed. Through the thick reinforced glass of the control booth, I could see the Arctic night, the aurora borealis dancing mockingly above the ice. And I saw their transport. A heavy-lift Osprey idling on the pad. But between me and that helicopter was the main assembly hall. And standing in the center of the hall, illuminated by the red emergency strobes, was the leader of the tactical team. He wasn't looking for me anymore. He was staring at the floor, where a grate had been torn open from the inside. Something wet and slick trailed from the grate. The leader looked up, and even at this distance, I saw the terror in his posture. He tapped his headset. "Command, this is Alpha 1. The target is loose. It's not just a sound anymore. It's biological." "Repeat, Object 77B has breached the hull." He slowly backed away, raising his rifle toward the ceiling. I looked up. Clinging to the overhead pipes, dripping freezing sludge, was a shape that defied geometry. It was pale, elongated, and it had too many limbs. It wasn't human. It was what the sound looked like when it grew flesh. The creature dropped. The room erupted in gunfire and inhuman shrieking. I slammed my hand onto the manual override for the pressure door, sealing myself in the airlock just as a spray of blood painted the glass. I was trapped between the monster, the mercenaries, and the freezing dark of the Arctic Ocean. I looked at the magnetic tape in my hand. I held the truth. Now I just had to survive long enough to scream it to the world. The silence that followed the explosion was heavier than the blast itself. For 3 seconds, the concussive force hung in the freezing air of Corridor 4B, a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. Then, the screaming started again, not from a human throat, but from the tortured metal of the bulkhead door behind me. The hydraulic seals were failing. Whatever was on the other side, the things that the Soviet records referred to only as the assets, were applying metric tons of pressure against the reinforced titanium. I checked the seal on my rebreather. The air in the lower levels was toxic, a cocktail of aerosolized coolant and something else, a metallic, copper-tasting heavy gas that set the Geiger counter on my chest rig clicking in a frantic, erratic rhythm. 3, 4 Roentgens and climbing. Not immediately fatal, but staying here was a death sentence in more ways than one. I racked the slide on the captured AK-12 I'd pulled off a frozen corpse 2 levels up. The polymer stock was cracked, but the action was smooth. I had 22 rounds left in the mag, plus 1 in the chamber. 23 chances to not die. Move! I whispered to myself, the sound of my own voice jarring inside the enclosed helmet. I pushed off the wall, keeping my center of gravity low. My boots crunched over shattered glass and frozen hydraulic fluid. The objective had shifted. Exploration was over. This was purely survival now. I needed to reach the reactor control room in Sector 7. According to the schematics I'd downloaded from the terminal in the officer's mess, Sector 7 had a hardline connection to the surface comms array, and, more importantly, manual overrides for the facility's blast doors. The hallway stretched out into the darkness, illuminated only by the strobing red of the emergency lights. Every shadow looked like movement. My tactical light cut a cone through the suspended dust, catching particles that glittered like diamonds. Ice. Everything down here was encased in it. I passed a row of observation windows, the glass thick and yellowed with age. Inside, the shapes of laboratory equipment loomed like skeletal giants. Centrifuges, isolation tanks, surgical tables with restraints designed for things much larger than men. I paused at a T-junction, slicing the pie around the corner with the muzzle of the rifle. Clear. But the smell hit me even through the filters, ozone and rotting meat. A pile of debris blocked the left path, so I took the right, heading deeper into the maintenance subgrid. As I moved, I pulled the crumbled flight log from my pocket, glancing at the frantic Cyrillic scribbles I had deciphered earlier. Asterisk protocol black. Asterisk. In the previous sectors, I assumed protocol black was a containment breach alarm. A standard scorched earth policy. But the deeper I went, the more the architecture suggested otherwise. The blast doors weren't designed to keep people out, they were designed to keep things in. And the firing ports on the automated turrets I'd bypassed? They were pointing inward, toward the barracks. A noise ahead froze me. A wet, rhythmic slapping sound, like wet leather hitting concrete. I killed my light instantly, plunging the corridor into the oppressive, crimson gloom of the emergency strobes. I slowed my breathing, employing the box breathing technique to lower my heart rate. Inhale 4, hold 4, exhale 4. The slapping grew louder. It was heavy. Bipedal, but uneven. As if one leg was dragging. I pressed myself into a recessed alcove housing a rusted fire extinguisher. Through the strobe light flickering, I saw it. It emerged from a ventilation duct 30 meters downrange. It wore the tattered remnants of a hazardous environment suit, the orange fabric fused to gray, necrotic flesh. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, elongated by whatever mutagen had been pumped into the base's water supply 40 years ago. One arm ended in a standard gloved hand. The other was a mass of calcified bone and muscle, dragging on the floor like a club. It didn't have a face, just a smooth, pale surface where eyes and a nose should have been, split by a vertical maw that breathed steam. It paused, tilting its head. It was hunting by sound. My finger tightened on the trigger, taking up the slack. I aimed for center mass. Headshots were risky on physiologies I didn't understand. If I engaged, the noise would draw the others, the ones battering down the door behind me. Tactical discipline demanded evasion, not confrontation. I unclipped a flare from my belt. I didn't ignite it. Instead, I pulled the pin on a flashbang, counted to 2, and rolled it down the hallway, past the creature. The grenade clattered. The creature snapped around with terrifying speed, screeching, a sound like metal grinding on metal. Asterisk bang. Asterisk. The flash blinded the corridor. I didn't wait to see the effect. I broke cover, sprinting in the opposite direction, my boots thudding heavy on the grating. Behind me, the creature roared in confusion, slashing at the walls. I hit the stairwell door, slammed the locking bar down, and vaulted the railing, descending 3 steps at a time. Level 6. The command deck. The temperature dropped further here. My HUD warned of hypothermia risk, but the adrenaline was keeping the cold at bay for now. I moved into the main server room. This was the brain of the facility. Rows of databanks stood silent, frosted over like tombstones. At the center of the room sat a primary terminal, its CRT monitor glowing with a faint, green phosphor burn. I approached it, connecting my data pad to the serial port. The decryption software chewed through the Soviet encryption algorithms, brute-forcing the 128-bit key. Access granted? I pulled up the file labeled Protocol Chorny, Protocol Black. As the text translated, the blood drained from my face. It wasn't a self-destruct sequence. It was a wake-up call. In the event of containment loss, the log read, asterisk. Sector 9 thermal regulators will be disabled. Core temperature will rise to critical levels. Objective, thaw subject 0. Released to surface for localized sterilization of compromised zone. Asterisk. My stomach turned. They weren't trying to kill the monsters with the reactor. They were using the reactor heat to wake up the big one. The Alpha. The reason this base was built. And by entering the base, by restoring partial power to open the doors, I had inadvertently initiated the thermal rise. The abandoned base wasn't dead, it was hibernating, and I was the alarm clock. I checked the system diagnostics. Reactor temp, 800 degrees Celsius. Subject 0 cryostatus, 88% thawed. Damn it! I hissed. I had to scram the reactor. If Subject 0 woke up, it wouldn't just be me dying down here. The logs suggested a biological weapon capable of surviving Arctic conditions, a predator that could reach the mainland settlements within days. I navigated to the reactor control submenu. Asterisk access denied. Authorization, commander level only. Asterisk. Of course. The manual override was 2 floors down, directly adjacent to the reactor core. Directly where the radiation was highest. Directly where the heat was waking up a nightmare. I grabbed a fresh magazine from my vest, tapping it against my helmet to seat the rounds. I checked my dosimeter again. 1 Roentgens. I fished a syringe of anti-rad meds from my medkit and jammed it into my thigh, gritting my teeth as the thick liquid burned its way into my muscle. It would buy me an hour before the sickness started degrading my motor skills. A heavy thud shuddered through the floor plates. Dust rained down from the ceiling. Then another thud. Rhythmic. Massive. Like a heartbeat made of concrete. Subject 0 was moving. I scanned the room for exits. The main lift was dead. The maintenance ladder was my only option. I slung the rifle and moved to the hatch. As I gripped the freezing cold rungs, the terminal behind me beeped. A new message flashed on the screen, automated and chilling in its simplicity. Asterisk. Protocol black active. Surface exfiltration routes sealed. Have a nice day, comrade. Asterisk. The base had locked me in. It wanted a fight. I began the descent into the darkness of the reactor pit, the air growing warmer, thicker, and tasting of iron. Below me, in the red-lit abyss, something massive drew a breath, a sound like a submarine venting ballast. I turned on my tactical light, the beam shaking slightly in my hand. Chapter 7. I muttered, staring into the abyss. The part where the hero usually dies. I dropped down, boots hitting the metal grating of level 7. The heat was immediate, a wave of dry, radioactive warmth. I raised the rifle. The shadows here weren't empty. I could hear the skittering of the smaller things retreating from the awakening Alpha. I advanced toward the reactor blast door, the only thing standing between the world and the horror thawing inside. Tactical reloads, check. Flashbangs, 1 left. Knife sharp. It was time to kill a god, or die trying. The readout on my wrist-mounted Geiger counter clicked a steady, rhythmic warning, a metronome counting down the seconds of my life. But radiation was the least of my concerns. The sub-zero air in Sector 7 tasted like copper and ozone, a metallic tang that bypassed the filters of my rebreather and settled deep in my lungs. I pressed my back against the frosted concrete of the corridor wall, checking the stolen AK-12 for the 3rd time in a minute. 20 rounds left in the magazine. A backup Sig Sauer P226 on my hip with 2 spare clips. Not enough. Not with what was hunting me. I was deep in the bowels of the facility now, far below the ice shelf, in the section marked on the schematics simply as Zaslin, the screen. The silence here was heavy, oppressive, broken only by the distant, groaning metal of the submarine pens shifting in the Arctic current miles above. But it wasn't the silence that had my heart hammering against my ribs. It was the noise that had just stopped. The heavy, wet footsteps of the cleaners, the Spetsnaz kill teams sent to sanitize the base, had ceased. They were communicating via localized comms, coordinating a sweep. They knew I was here. But they didn't know about the third player on the board. I slid low, moving heel to toe to dampen the sound of my boots on the grate. My objective was the command nexus, 300 meters down a hallway that offered zero cover. The tactical situation was foobar. My thermal optics were flickering, batteries dying in the extreme cold, leaving me with intermittent ghosts of heat signatures. I peered around the corner. The hallway was bathed in the strobing red light of the emergency power grid. Shadows stretched and retracted like breathing lungs. Then, the radio's silence broke. Not a voice, but a scream. It came from the sector I had just vacated, Sector 6. It was a wet, gurgling sound that was abruptly cut off by the distinctive crack thump of suppressed 5.45mm fire. Automatic fire. Panicked. Protocol black. I moved. I sprinted down the corridor, abandoning stealth for speed. The screams behind me multiplied. The Spetsnaz team wasn't engaging me. They were being engaged. I reached the blast door of the command nexus and slammed my hand onto the manual override lever. It was frozen shut. I cursed, stripping off a glove to get a better grip, ignoring the searing pain of skin touching supercooled metal. I hauled down with everything I had. The hydraulics whined, protesting decades of dormancy, and the door groaned upward just enough for me to roll underneath. I scrambled to my feet inside the nexus, raising my rifle. Clear. The room was a circular amphitheater of dead monitors and decaying consoles, dominated by a central holographic table that was currently dark. But the air here was different. Warmer. Humid. And it smelled of soil. Rich, black earth and rot. I moved to the main terminal, bypassing the encrypted biometrics with the keycard I'd looted from the dead officer in Chapter 4. The system roared to life, fans screaming as they cleared dust. Green Cyrillic text scrolled frantically across the main screen. I didn't need to read Russian to understand the diagrams flashing before me. Protocol Black wasn't a biological weapon. It wasn't a virus. The schematics showed a neural overlay mapping. A frequency. The Soviets hadn't found something in the ice. They had brought something here to test. The base was a massive amplifier. The diagrams showed human brains, the neural pathways blackened and rewritten by a ferrofluid substance injected directly into the spinal column. The fluid acted as a receiver. The black was a hive mind interface, designed to create the perfect soldier, fearless, painless, commanded by a single radio frequency. But the frequency had drifted. I accessed the surveillance logs. The footage from 1986 played. I watched as the base commander initiated the protocol. I watched the soldiers in the mess hall stop eating. I watched them stand up in unison, their eyes rolling back, black fluid leaking from their tear ducts. They didn't attack each other. They turned to the camera. They tore the camera down. Subject status, dormant/preserved, the screen read. Then it updated. Subject status, active. A heavy thud against the blast door behind me made me spin around. The Spetsnaz team. They were welding through. Sparks showered down on the other side. But then, the welding stopped. I heard the muffled shouts of men who were highly trained professionals realizing they were no longer at the top of the food chain. The sounds of gunfire erupted again, closer this time, right outside the door. Then, the sound of tearing metal. Not cutting. Tearing. I looked back at the console. I had to kill the signal. If Protocol Black was a frequency controlling the subjects, I needed to jam it or destroy the transmitter. The transmitter was located in the geothermal core, 2 levels down. I tapped the console, downloading the frequency data to my PDA. As the progress bar crawled, I scanned the room for exits. A maintenance hatch in the floor. It led to the cable routing crawl spaces. Tight, claustrophobic, but it bypassed the main corridors. The blast door behind me began to buckle. A dent appeared in the center, protruding inward. Something with immense strength was hitting it. Asterisk bam. Asterisk the steel groaned. Asterisk bam. Asterisk a rivet popped, pinging off the far wall like a bullet. The download hit 100%. I snatched the PDA and ripped open the floor hatch. The darkness below was absolute. I activated a chem light and dropped it in. It fell 10 feet, illuminating a tangle of thick, black cables. But the cables were moving. I squinted. They weren't cables. The insulation had been stripped away, replaced by a thick, viscous black sludge that pulsed. The biological matter from the experiments had grown. It had integrated into the ship's infrastructure. The base wasn't just housing the monsters. The base was the monster. The blast door breached. It wasn't a soldier that came through. It was a nightmare of flesh and machinery. A human form, but elongated, the limbs broken and reset at impossible angles, the skin translucent and gray. Veins black with the ferrofluid pumped visibly beneath the dermis. It wore the tattered remnants of a Soviet naval uniform, fused into its flesh. In its hand, it didn't hold a gun. Its arm ended in a sharpened bone spur where the hand should have been. It shrieked, a digital, glitching sound that hurt my teeth, and lunged. I dropped into the hole, pulling the hatch shut above me just as the creature slammed into it. I fell, hitting the mass of pulsing cables with a wet thud. The smell was overpowering now. I was sliding down a chute of biomechanical horror, the walls slick with the black fluid. I scrambled for purchase, my boots slipping, until I hit a junction box and halted my fall. I was in the walls. I could hear them scuttling in the vents above and below me. The cleaners were dead. The gunfire had stopped. Now, it was just me, the cold, and a battalion of necrotic super-soldiers connected to a hive mind that lived in the architecture. I checked my localized map. The geothermal core was straight down. I had to rappel through the service shaft, rig the reactor to overload, and get to the subpen before the whole place turned into a radioactive crater. I racked the slide on the AK-12. "Come and get me," I whispered into the dark. From the darkness below, a dozen pairs of eyes, glowing with a faint, electric blue luminescence, opened in unison. They heard me. The condensation inside my stolen hazardous environment suit had begun to freeze, creating a jagged rime of ice that scraped against my jaw with every ragged breath. I was huddled behind the rusted bulk of a diesel generator in Sector 4, the auxiliary turbine hall. The silence here wasn't empty, it was heavy, pressurized. Like the millions of tons of Arctic water pressing against the titanium hull just meters away. My heart rate monitor, visible on the cracked hood of the helmet, strobed a warning red, 140 BPM. I forced myself to initiate a tactical breathing cycle. 4 seconds in, hold for 4 seconds out. Panic was a luxury I couldn't afford. Not with the Spetsnaz kill squad sweeping the catwalks above, and certainly not with what I now knew was growing in the reactor core. I checked the magazine of the AK-12 I'd scavenged from the first mercenary I'd ambushed. It was a polymer-heavy, modernized variant of the classic platform, fitted with a thermal optic that was currently my only edge in the sepulchral gloom of the base. 17 rounds left. No spare mags. I racked the charging handle, checking the brass, and eased the selector switch to semi-automatic. The acoustics in the turbine hall were a nightmare. A single shot would ricochet and amplify, giving away my position instantly. I had to move. The layout schematics I'd pulled from the dead captain's terminal in Chapter 6 burned in my mind. The entrance to the Black Archive, the epicenter of Protocol Black, was 3 sectors down. Past the decontamination airlocks that the Soviets had welded shut 40 years ago. Above me, the metallic clang-clang-clang of magnetic boots on the gantry stopped. I froze, blending my silhouette into the shadows of the generator. Through the grating, I saw the sweeping cone of a weapon-mounted laser sight cutting through the suspended dust particles. They were using comms discipline, moving in a standard bounding overwatch pattern. These weren't just mercenaries. This was Vimpel or Alpha Group. High-tier operators sent to sanitize a mess that had been festering since the Cold War. Sector clear. A voice crackled over the unencrypted frequency I was monitoring. Moving to pressure door 7B. Radiation spikes detected. Copy, Vulture 1. Engage containment protocols if you see movement. Nothing leaves this facility. Protocol Black is in effect. Burn it all. Asterisk, burn it all. Asterisk, the phrase sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the sub-zero temperature. I slipped away from the generator, moving heel to toe to minimize sound, rolling my weight to avoid snapping the brittle. Frozen debris littering the floor. I made it to the maintenance hatch and engaged the manual override wheel. It groaned, a sound like a dying whale, and I froze again, weapon raised. Nothing. I slipped through. The corridor beyond was a descent into madness. This was closer to the epicenter. The walls here weren't just rusted, they were changed. A thick, bioluminescent lichen, pulsing with a faint, sickly violet light, coated the bulkheads. It wasn't plant matter. As I moved closer, aiming the thermal sight, the heat signature was wrong. It was cold, colder than the air. I looked closer at a patch of the substance near a junction box. It wasn't growing on the metal, it was converting it. The steel was transmuting into this organic slag, This was Protocol Black. It wasn't a virus. It was a terraforming agent, a biological weapon designed to rewrite matter at a molecular level. Harvested from whatever they found in the trench below. I reached the airlock to the archive. The control panel was fused with the violet growth. I used the butt of the rifle to smash the glass on the emergency manual release, ignoring the squelching sound the biomass made, like wet meat. I hauled the lever down. The hydraulics screamed, fighting decades of corrosion and the organic glue, but the door hissed open just wide enough for me to squeeze through. Inside, the air was different. Ozone and copper. The room was a massive server farm, ancient magnetic tape reels the size of car tires lining the walls. But in the center, bathed in emergency amber light, was a containment cylinder. And inside that cylinder was the source. It looked like a human nervous system, stripped of flesh, suspended in a suspension fluid that defied gravity, floating in a perfect sphere. But the nerves were made of black, shifting ferrofluid. I rushed to the main console. If I could upload the data, transmit the truth to the satellite uplink I'd aligned in the communications tower, the world would know. I plugged in the drives. The text on the screen was Cyrillic, green phosphorus burning my retinas. I hit the translation key on my wrist comp. Asterisk Project Obelisk. Subject 001. Status, critical mass. Asterisk. Asterisk notes, the entity does not infect. It resonates. It sings to the carbon. Asterisk. A loud thrum vibrated through the floor plates. The cylinder in the center of the room began to vibrate. The black ferrofluid nerves twitched. Suddenly, the tactical radio in my ear screamed with static, cutting through the silence. Target acquired in the archive. Converge! Converge! I spun around, raising the rifle. The door I'd squeezed through was blocked. Not by soldiers, but by the violet biomass. It was moving, growing rapidly, sealing the exit. I was trapped. I looked at the security monitors on the console. The Spetsnaz team was at the main blast doors, planting breaching charges. They weren't coming in to kill me. They were coming in to kill it. Warning! The facility's automated voice boomed, distorted and slow, like a record being dragged. Protocol Black breach detected. Sterilization sequence initiated. Thermobaric venting in T-10 minutes. 10 minutes. I frantically typed commands into the terminal. I didn't need to stop the countdown. I needed to open the subdock. The only way out was down, into the water. Into the abyss where this thing came from. I found the schematic for the escape submersibles. Most were marked offline or compromised. Only one remained, Pod 4, located in the torpedo loading bay, 2 levels down. Asterisk boom. Asterisk the blast doors buckled. The mercenaries had blown the locks. Smoke poured in, and through the thermal scope, I saw 3 heat signatures rushing the room. I dropped behind the console just as bullets chewed up the ancient computer banks, sending sparks and plastic shards showering over me. Suppressing fire! A voice roared in Russian. I popped up, firing 2 controlled pairs. The first round caught the lead operator in the throat protector. He went down gurgling. The second pinged off the heavy armor of the next man. They scrambled for cover. I didn't have the firepower to win this. I grabbed a flare from my belt, a magnesium distress flare I'd found in the survival lockers. I pulled the pin and didn't throw it at them. I threw it at the containment cylinder. The glass shattered. The suspension fluid rushed out, hitting the floor with a hiss. The black nerve entity flopped onto the deck plates. Exposed to the air, it reacted instantly. It shrieked, a psychic sound that wasn't heard but felt, a migraine driving a spike through my frontal lobe. The violet biomass on the walls surged forward, reacting to its master's cry. The mercenary screamed as the walls themselves lashed out, tendrils of biomechanical matter seizing their limbs, pulling them into the structure of the room. It was chaos. Absolute, high-stakes bedlam. I used the distraction, sprinting toward a maintenance vent on the far wall. The air was filled with gunfire and the wet tearing of suits. I kicked the grate out and dove into the dark, sliding down a chute that smelled of grease and death. I tumbled out onto a mesh walkway in the torpedo bay. My HUD was flickering. Asterisk radiation alert. Suit integrity, 65%. Asterisk the sterilization countdown blared. Asterisk 7 minutes. Asterisk. I scrambled toward Pod 4. It was a rusted, spherical bathyscaphe, barely larger than a coffin. But as I reached the hatch, I saw the problem. The launch clamps were manual. I had to release them from the outside. I could get in, or I could launch it. I couldn't do both. Then movement. A shadow detached itself from the gloom across the bay. It was the mercenary commander, the one I'd heard on the radio. His helmet was torn off, revealing a face scarred by cold burns, eyes wide with a fanatic's resolve. He held a detonator in one hand and a pistol in the other. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the fuel lines running along the ceiling. "It doesn't leave," he rasped in broken English, raising the pistol. "We all burn." He wasn't trying to kill me. He was going to detonate the fuel reserves prematurely, vaporizing the bay, me, and the escape pod to ensure the entity didn't hitch a ride. We stood there for a split second, a standoff at the end of the world. The facility groaned around us, the entity upstairs screaming its psychic resonance, the countdown ticking, the cold biting through my suit. I raised my rifle, aiming not at him, but at the hydraulic line above his head. "Protocol Black," I whispered, and squeezed the trigger. The service ladder inside the ventilation stack was a rusted spine climbing 300 feet into the dark. My gloves, shredded from the engagement in the reactor room, offered zero purchase on the rime-slicked steel. Every pull was a gamble against gravity and exhaustion. Below me, the groaning metal of the submarine base echoed like the belly of a dying whale. The demolition charges I'd rigged to the main support columns were on a 5-minute timer. It was a crude tactical solution, but Protocol Black required a scorched earth contingency. If the intel in the waterproof case strapped to my chest was accurate, nothing in this facility could be allowed to thaw. The air grew thinner, colder. My breath plumed before me, freezing instantly on my eyelashes. My tactical display flickered, battery critical. The EMP shielding on the comms gear had held up against the facility's strange magnetic anomalies, but the cold was a slower, more insidious killer. I checked the suppressed 416 Hong Kong dollars slung across my chest. 7 rounds in the mag. 1 spare magazine. Not enough for a war, just enough for a funeral. I breached the surface hatch, shouldering it open against the weight of accumulated drift. The Arctic wind hit me like a physical blow, a 60-knot scream that tore the heat from my body in seconds. Visibility was 0, a wide-out purgatory. This was the extraction point, the remains of the old radar array on the northern shelf. I rolled out of the hatch and keyed my mic. Watcher 1 to Skylark. Assets secured. Structure critical. Hot extraction required. Immediate. Static. Then, a voice that sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. Skylark copies. ETA 2 mics. Be advised, Watcher. You have company. Thermal contacts on the ridge. Keep your head down. I scrambled into the lee of a collapsed concrete pylon. The radar array was a graveyard of twisted steel, skeletal fingers grasping at the storm. Through the whiteout, I saw the faint, ghostly green of thermal blooms in my optic. 3 distinct signatures moving in a sweeping wedge formation. They weren't standard Russian infantry. They moved with the fluid, predatory grace of Tier 1 operators. No heat signatures from their weapons, likely suppressed, subsonic ammunition designed to cycle in sub-zero temps without a muzzle flash. This was the cleanup crew. I checked the detonator. 2 minutes. A round sparked off the concrete inches from my face. No sound, just the crack of supersonic displacement followed by the impact. I dropped prone, sliding on the ice. They had thermal overlapping my position. I couldn't trade fire. I had to dictate the geometry of the engagement. I pulled a smoke canister, not for cover. Smoke was useless in this wind, but to bait a thermal response. I tossed it left, deep into a drift. The bloom of heat from the chemical reaction drew a controlled burst of fire. I surged right, flanking around a rusted generator housing. I caught the point man exposed. He was a silhouette against the swirling snow, clad in white composite armor that looked almost organic. I squeezed the trigger twice. Controlled pair. The rounds punched through his chest plate. He didn't scream. He just folded. Protocol black. The dossier in the case felt heavy, radioactive in its implications. The files I'd scanned downstairs weren't about nuclear launch codes. They were about biology. The submarine, the K-324, hadn't been refitted for war. It had been refitted for containment. They had found something deep in the Nansen Basin, something that thrived in the crushed depth and the cold. The Soviets hadn't abandoned the base because of budget cuts. They had abandoned it because the crew had started changing. I moved again, lungs burning. The second hostile was suppressing my last known position. I could hear the thwip 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 of rounds tearing into the snow. I needed to reach the extraction strobe beacon 10 meters ahead. 1 minute to detonation, I whispered to myself. The ground beneath me shuddered. Not the explosives yet. The facility below was groaning under the pressure of the shifting ice shelf. The structural integrity was failing. I broke cover, sprinting for the strobe. A shadow emerged from the whiteout directly in my path. The third operator. Close quarters. Too close for the rifle. He lunged, a serrated blade flashing in the gray light. I caught his wrist, the impact jarring my bones, and drove my knee into his midsection. It was like kicking a concrete wall. His armor was rigid, heavy. He backhanded me, sending me skidding across the ice. My vision swam. I tasted copper. He stood over me, raising the weapon. Through the shattered visor of his helmet, I saw his face. I froze. The skin was translucent, blue-veined, and tight against the skull. But it was the eyes, black sclera, no iris, reflecting the storm like polished obsidian. He wasn't wearing a mask for the cold. He didn't need one. He was part of the cold. The containment breach hadn't just been in the sub. It was the cleanup crew. They were the subjects. Protocol Black, the thing rasped, the voice sounding like grinding glaciers. Quarantine is absolute. I fumbled for the detonator with numb fingers. So is this. I triggered the charges early. The world beneath us turned to liquid. A dull, subterranean roar swallowed the wind. The ventilation stack I just climbed erupted, a geyser of fire and debris shooting into the sky. The shockwave cracked the ice shelf. The operator stumbled, the ground beneath him tilting violently as the foundation of the radar array sheared off and slid toward the ocean. I scrambled backward, clawing at the ice, as the fissure widened between us. The thing stared at me, unblinking, as it slid into the dark water below, swallowed by the collapse of the base. Then, the thrum of rotors. A shadow descended from the clouds, a MH-60 Black Hawk, painted matte black with no markings. A hoist cable dropped, swinging wildly in the gale. I hooked in, my fingers barely functioning. Go! 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 I screamed into the mic. The winch yanked me upward just as the rest of the radar platform crumbled into the Arctic Sea. I dangled over the abyss, watching the massive hole in the ice where the Soviet base had been. The water churned, foaming and black. For a second, just before the clouds swallowed me, I thought I saw shapes moving under the surface. Massive, pale geometries rearranging themselves in the deep. They pulled me into the cabin. The warmth hit me, stinging my skin. The crew chief didn't slap me on the back. He didn't offer a blanket. He pointed a weapon at me. I looked around. The interior of the chopper was lined with heavy plastic sheeting. A biohazard containment cell. 2 men in full level 4 hazmat suits were waiting, sealable transport bags in hand. Secure the asset, one of them said, his voice distorted. Neutralize the carrier if he shows symptoms. I froze, the adrenaline crashing into dread. I looked down at my hand, the one the operator had grabbed. The glove was torn. On my wrist, where the skin had touched his, a pattern of black veins was already tracing its way up my forearm. Pulsing in time with a heartbeat that felt too slow to be mine. Skylark to command, the pilot said, banking the chopper south, away from the ruin. Assets secured. Base destroyed. Initiating Protocol Black Phase 2. I gripped the dossier case tighter. The base wasn't the secret. The sub wasn't the secret. We were. I looked out the porthole at the endless, indifferent white of the Arctic. The cold hadn't just preserved the past, it was incubating the future. And I was bringing it home.